creative people. Thanks for tuning into Melody or Witchcraft. I'm your host, Catherine Petrocelli. On the podcast, we hear a poet read a work of their own and an Emily Dickinson poem of their choosing that contributed to their work. We discuss poetry, Dickinson, the fluidity of time, and the scope and sources of creative inspiration. The past is such a curious creature, Dickinson wrote. Join us to find out how it can teach us about our now.
You know how dreary to be somebody.
I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I and silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary, here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing then.
That was today's guest, Dana Levin. Dana Levin is the author of 5 books of poetry. Her latest is Now Do You Know Where You Are, Copper Canyon, a 2022 New York Times notable book, an NPR book we love. Levin teaches for the Bennington Writing Seminars, the MFA program at Bennington College, and serves as Distinguished Writer-in-Residence at Maryville University in St. Louis. Her first book of prose, House of Feels, comes out from Grey Wolf Press in 2027. Welcome, Dana. Hi.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So I was just sharing with you about how many versions of this poem exist in song. At least 4 dozen.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, it seems to be something that people are interested in. Why this poem for you?
Oh gosh. Well, that first line, I felt a funeral in my brain, both sonically and imagistically, is just wow. But I think I first read this poem probably in late high school, like when I was in my later teens. And I think this first line is kind of catnip for teenage angst. I felt a funeral in my brain. But it's also it's such a weird poem.
Yeah.
People really, I think, sometimes forget just how weird Emily Dickinson's poems can be. And it was much later, like when I became an academic, that I realized so many of her poems fit right into the American Gothic tradition, which is like Edgar Allan Poe. And what that tradition is so interested in is psychic states of disturbance, in part. We get ghosts and graveyards and stuff, but like the psychic disturbance component of that tradition. And she's very interested in the psyche. She's very interested in what is consciousness and what goes on in there. You can see this poem so filmically too.
Yes, I have that in my notes. It is so cinematic.
Yeah. And also she just really takes advantage of the regular meter to get this sense of treading, this sense of boom, 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 boom.
Mm-hmm.
And I also had an interesting time with this poem because the first time I read the version that had been edited, poorly edited. Is it Mabel Todd Loomis or Mabel
Loomis Todd? Yes, yeah. Mabel Loomis Todd.
Yeah, I don't know if your audience knows that the first Dickinson that the wider public gets is just a chop job because
100%.
Mabel decided that all of Dickinson's idiosyncrasies with punctuation must have been quote unquote mistakes. And sometimes whole stanzas got chopped.
Yeah, her rhyme got changed. Obviously her punctuation.
Yeah. So when I first read this poem, it ended on the second to the last stanza. as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I and silence some strange race, wrecked, solitary, here. And when I found out that there was a real final stanza, I hated it.
Oh, you hated the new stanza?
I hated the new stanza. I was so upset
Wow. You
because
hated the plank and reason?
yes, I hated it. I mean, I think I was in my 20s when I found this out, and I just because I loved the ending on the shipwreck and the imagistic clarity, and
It does sound a bit like an ending, I won't lie.
it does, yes. But the weirdest part of this poem is the last stanza, right?
Yeah.
And,
Well, and then we
and
complete that, right? We have sense in the first stanza and then we end on reason, reason breaking, but nonetheless.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's a stanza that I can just cogitate about for a long time. And then a plank and reason broke, and I dropped down and down and hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing then. Like, what's happened?
Yeah.
She's inside her brain at the start of this poem, right? Now, it'd be pretty easy to, I guess, decide that the end of the poem is death, but I think it's maybe something odder. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah, well, in a way, for me, this poem mimics kind of her offstage observational approach, her life of the mind. And
Yeah.
it taps in maybe, and perhaps this goes into like all those songwriters who want to put it to music, a certain kind of fantasy of getting to witness your own funeral. Like, oh, I want to be on fly on the wall. What's happening? What are they saying about me? I don't know. Perhaps pseudo universal, although there's many, many traditions of death out there. But yeah, it's weird. Now, I have certain strong feelings about the analysis of the poem that wants to say it's a mental breakdown. I don't subscribe.
Ah, I don't subscribe to mental breakdown. I think she was quite in control of her faculties. But I will say, I think it's been twice now or three times I've team taught a class on Dickinson's work with a 19th century lit person at my school. And then I just did a really interesting workshop panel for the Emily Dickinson Museum with a therapist and poet named Ayelet Amitai. And she found out that Dickinson's father was like a benefactor for an insane asylum. I begin to sort of wonder about like, did she ever visit it? Did her father ever talk about it? Did she, what did she think about that? And then there's so many poems that seem to gesture at what today we would call depression. I wonder about her. Not an armchair person like, obviously, Emily Dickinson suffered from clinical depression. I wouldn't say that. But I think she's very familiar with mood fluctuation and is interested in it.
Oh, yeah. And actually, her mother, some
Oh yeah,
believe, suffered from depression. There's some
that's
evidence
right.
of that as well. Clearly, those things can run in families, etc. And yeah. But yeah, I mean, I can't help but think of the famous line from one of her letters, "Pardon my sanity, Mrs. Holland, in a world insane." It's like, who's really crazy here? Because it's so easy, isn't it, to say, "Ugh, she must have been nuts." That I feel like that's
Oh
that's
no.
so reductive. I bring it out because I have read that too many times.
Really? Is it like the
Yeah.
classification of Dickinson? Like,
You can almost feel the corset tightening. It's like these sort of circles of restriction that she lived within. She's a woman in the 19th century, she's a woman in 19th century New England, she's in high society in that time. That's a lot to hold. And if you want to be an individual in that space, you must be crazy, right? Or they want to tell you are because you're a
mm,
threat. You're a threat to breaking that apart.
yeah. Her social and financial circumstances of her family, I think it was also protective of her. She could be eccentric as opposed to nuts.
Right.
But I do think there's a tendency, especially with contemporary poetry readers, to pathologize anybody they're reading. That goes along with the way in which we have a tendency, in this era to pathologize all emotional states other than happiness. Especially, I think, in America, there's a lot of intolerance and judgment for what we would call depression or what we would call anxiety or even what we would call anger, depending on
Oh,
who's
yeah.
being angry. And there's just not a sense that, like, the emotional range of the human is vast and nuanced and has many ups and downs, and that's just part of who we are. And it doesn't mean that we all need to like pop a pill. And so I think sometimes there's a quickness to want to label poets, especially poets of the past, as a way of, I guess, getting a hold of their oddnesses and also a way of identifying with them too. Because I think that we all have a tendency in this era to identify with our diagnoses,
Mm-hmm.
especially young
Mm-hmm.
people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I really appreciate you bringing that out. And I mean, I guess any poem is a peek into someone else's mind. And I don't know if those poets of the past bring something different for you than your contemporaries, or is that too broad a group to say poets of the past? Or are those pathologies that show up because we have the hard and fast biography that's no longer mutating?
Well, I'll kind of do this in a circuitous way. I have a colleague at Maryville University named Jesse Cavadlo, and he just wrote a book called Rock of Pages, which is a look at heavy metal music through the lens of being a literary critic, because he loves heavy metal music. He plays in a heavy metal band. He has his whole life. Heavy metal music is not something I ever resonated with, but he makes this complete case for it as being part of the tradition of in literature in English, where like Lucifer in Paradise Lost, the great anti-hero. You even said there was like a metal band that did I Felt a Funeral in My Brain, right?
Yes, absolutely. There was a couple.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
like the gothic components of Dickinson, I don't know anybody who would make a connection. He actually talks about this poem in the book, who makes a connection between Emily Dickinson, virginal poet and white recluse, and somebody going, I felt a funeral in my brain, and just like headbanger music. And so what's always interesting to me about the poets of the past is how alive they are once you can get past your assumptions about them or your prejudices about them. Once you kind of visit with them as if you don't know a thing about them. I mean, there's been a lot of revision of Dickinson's gifts to us over the last 20 years in particular. And I think most people who read her with any intensity now have a more nuanced and complex picture of who she was as a person. But, for the longest time, you just thought she was this innocuous woman, this extremely one dimensional, virginal, ethereal, extremely tamed version of her. And she is much more wild in the poems than that. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. I do understand that some of the foreign translations of Dickinson can at times go back to those original Mabel Loomis Todd
Mm,
editions because they're public domain.
right.
So it's a bit unfortunate, but I suppose it's already the puzzle of language to language and culture to culture. Well, I'd love it if you would read the poem of yours that you brought, and we can talk about it kind of with our Dickinson glasses on and then maybe with our Dickinson glasses off.
All right. Well, this poem is called Rogue Nun. It would take a lot to walk in peace every minute of the day. You being God for the other one who is being God for you. Throwing your lights around, your individual lights around, while trying to address each other, dear luminous. At night, people curled up with devices, arranging assemblies for poems or sex. I felt just fine, thank you, in my rare patois of privacy. I wanted nothing to do with a you. I saw a woman once reading from a lectern, nipples erect through her pink Angora sweater. Bleached hair, white skin, a frail-looking, steely-hearted Mary. One of the writer nuns. I recognized a sister. Nun without an order. Rogue nun.
Thank you. That is wonderful. And I know it's the title poem of a new chapbook of yours, correct?
Yeah, the poet Brian Tier runs a micro press, a letterpress, where he hand designs, hand makes these chapbooks, and he does them in series. So there's always 4 chapbooks in a series. And this is the first of series 10. His press is called Albion Books, and he makes just gorgeous, gorgeous. This thing is so gorgeous. I mean, I love how it
Oh,
looks.
wow.
And
You'll have to send me
love.
a picture. I will put it in the show notes.
Oh, okay.
Do the 4 books in the series connect? Is he choosing them as companion books or?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if he thinks that way or not. I subscribe. I haven't quite ever connected with that kind of through line, but maybe. I don't know.
Your poem has such an arresting first line in the same way that the Dickinson poem does, although they're worlds apart. It's much more of a potential for orality. It's spoken language. It comes alive in that way for me. And so I really, really appreciate that. So just to take people back, it would take a lot to walk in peace every minute of the day, is the first line. Yes, yes. And then we get this first part of the poem where we're introduced to ideas around light and what a you, a couple of yous would need to do to shore each other up as a
Yes.
couple, I
I'm
think.
really glad that comes through.
That's kind of what I read there,
Yeah,
right?
no, that's what I'm,
And
yeah.
then this so very Dickinsonian, I felt just fine, thank you, in my rare patois of privacy.
Yeah.
Great. And then the second part of the poem, we get this scene, we get a story. We're going to pull back, we're going to illustrate this just a bit. So here's
Yeah.
this woman at a lectern, and she's in the order of the writers. She's married to
Yeah.
the muse.
Yes.
Yeah.
Totally. Yep.
And,
Yeah.
those erect nipples, what if she's aroused just by her own writing?
Yes. Well, this was something I actually witnessed, and I was fascinated by it. I was fascinated by her, and I was fascinated by the erect nipples for just the reason I was like, wow, like this is like, wow, to be, aroused by whatever you're doing up there reading actually, she was a fiction writer.
The use of sister is so amazing. One of the writer nuns, I recognized a sister.
Yeah. This poem hung around. I wrote it a long time ago, actually, and it never felt like it belonged to any of the books I was working on. But the story of how this book came together is so amazing to me because I sent Brian a bunch of essays for this prose book that I'm working on. And what he sent me back was one of those essays cut in half, revealing this prose poem cycle that I had sent him from a previous book called Banana Palace. And then I had months earlier sent him poems. What do you think about these? And Rogue Nun was one of them. And he went and he took one poem and put it at the beginning and put Rogue Nun at the end. And what was so amazing about reading what he did and why he's such a genius editor is I felt like the entire chapbook is the story of how the Rogue Nun came to be.
Ah, yeah.
And the Rogue Nun, it really it's an alter ego for me. I was alone and celibate for 15 years from around like age 37 until I met John at the age of 52. And I really, at the time, it had been a choice. I just could not, I didn't want, I was lonely, but I just could not be intimate without emotional depth, emotional connection, which I was not really conscious of back then. I wasn't quite capable of. because I was a wounded, defended creature. So
Aren't we all?
I was, well, so those 15 years they were actually really important to, working out a lot of stuff and being ready when John walked into my life. But they are also, I wrote, gosh, how many of my books? 4 out of the 5 while in that space. And I had really decided, maybe this is done. Maybe this part of my life is done. Maybe my relational life and my erotic life is, which I had a lively one in my youth, but maybe it's gone. And I got to the point where I was like, okay, that's fine, And I felt like a rogue nun. I just felt like I'm not even Catholic. I was raised Jewish and I really resonate with Buddhist teachings, but this idea of a figure who is in devotion to something higher, but not belonging to any kind of sect or cloister or, rogue nun. And now I love this poem and I love that identity. And I mean, I don't feel like I'm the rogue nun anymore, but it was such a great, wonderful surprise when Brian sent me the manuscript he wanted to work with. And I was like, oh my God, like this is the story of Rogue Nun.
That is a huge gift. Yeah. To have that poetry friend in the right place
Yeah,
that can see you.
for sure. Yeah, it was just an amazing gift. And then, thinking about when you asked me, like, what would you submit as a poem that is in relationship or conversation with Dickinson? I automatically thought about this poem because she too was a writer nun.
Absolutely.
And that mix, that the spiritual inquiry, the kind of psycho-spiritual inquiry around what does it take to be in relationship, right? And what do you do with your own personality, which in this poem, I guess, is light.
Mm.
Throwing your light around, your individual lights around while trying to address each other, dear luminous. And how does that turn into peace? How can you walk every day with peace when you're in the middle of this kind of relational tussle? And I think, the other thing about those 15 years of being single is I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to tussle with poems. And I guess
Right.
I just didn't feel like I had the capacity to do both.
To be an individual or to be connected, it's like the connectedness demands a kind of softness right, that's missing, for example, from our woman at the lectern in the second half of this poem.
Yeah.
And compromise, that's right. That's part of the softness.
Yeah.
So it has to be given willingly,
Yeah. And
you could
actually, that
say.
was one of the things I loved about, I think one of the reasons I was so struck by it was the fiction writer Mary Gateskill. I just will say I was
All right, no secrets here.
yeah, it's
It's
a real
ours.
Mary, but I was just her presence. She is a tiny creature, small, and looks frail. Oh, and the fiction that she reads, they're so steely and odd and interesting. And I was just so struck by the frailness, the confidence, the erect nipples, the absolute uncompromising vibe.
It's great here, that frail looking, steely hearted. I mean, what a wonderful pair of hyphenated adjectives to set up. And then Mary, and she was.
Yeah, maybe that's what, kind of made the poem happen was, the connotations of her name. But, Dickinson too is a kind of frail looking, steely hearted presence.
Yeah. Oh, it's such good stuff. Oh my gosh. I was thinking again about another line from a different letter, actually, because of your poem. She was writing as a young woman to one of her friends, and she says, God keep me from what they call households.
Yes.
And I feel like that also speaks to, yeah, this kind of tussle of the mind at the beginning of the poem.
In a highly secularized culture, how do you find your cloister and let it be okay, as a woman in particular? For a woman to choose solitude is very judged by wider culture. When I was in my late 20s, I taught Soviet refugees to speak English in New York City. And one time, one of them said to me, Dana, why are you not married? And their, English is not great. And so then one of them goes, what's wrong with you? That like your single status means you are somehow deficient, a defect, right? And the idea that you might choose it and feel empowered by it, not because you were not chosen, but because it just is the thing that's calling you. And to not do that within the religious structure that's available to us in terms of like nunnery or reclusion or whatever, a lot of people don't get it. They
No.
they just, yeah.
For me, I think that's the thread again. How can a woman be okay on her own? What is her choice saying about my choice? What is her choice saying about the structure that we have developed here?
Yeah.
Oh no, this is scary. She's wrong.
Yeah. Even today, it is still really difficult to maintain a devoted writing life and a devoted family life at the same time, because women still in most households are doing most of the work of maintaining family, maintaining relations, maintaining the house. It's still not an equal participation in a lot of partnerships. I think that for me, I was just not willing to compromise my relationship with the muse. Looking back at myself, especially in my 20s and 30s, I don't think I had a strong enough personality to have been able to negotiate that well. I think I probably would have put my poems aside in service to family and partner. I didn't want to.
I get it. Isn't any poem, I guess, simply by the fact that it was written, saying, and I feel this, I felt this in your poem and in the Dickinson poem, how do we do this? How are we going to get through this? I wonder if you have a particular way you might characterize the subject matter of your poems. I know, you've written a lot about climate, and is there kind of an easy way to sort of corral what your major subjects are? Or, and I guess I'm asking this and also thinking about writing within our time and from our particular times,
Yeah.
and whether a kind of hyper contextualization isn't maybe a good thing, in the sense that maybe it's even more important to document the specifics, whether they are going to be exactly like what comes after us or if they're going to be completely different what comes after us. It feels like either way it's super important to speak directly from, I mean, we can't help it, but there are ways that we can get more explicit about talking from our time.
Yeah. Well, like my last book was all about living through the first Trump administration, and it was all about change, but concentric circles of change, because at the same time that Trump was elected in 2016, I was getting ready to leave Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I had lived for 19 years, and moved to St. Louis, Missouri, a place I knew very little about. And my cat, my beloved cat, my sister always referred to him as my primary love object through those 15 years. He died. Soon I would meet John, which, I didn't know was coming, but that was a big, major change for me. And so I guess if there's a through line to my work, increasingly, it's the classic lyric project of what does it mean to be alive? And as you said, how do we do this? How do we get through it? But wanting to have all of those concentric circles featured. I'm thinking about the poet Katie Peterson when she reviewed, I think it was Sky Burial, my third book. She said something about how it's a rare poet that's going to include in a poem both a meditation on Tibetan gods and then talk about kitty litter. Okay, so I'm very interested. I feel driven to document the whole of things. So
Yeah.
there's local life, kitty litter, bills, sitting in a doctor's waiting room, going to have coffee with a former student, and then contending with everything that's surrounding it in terms of, what's happening at the level of governmental policy and politics and, what's happening on Earth. I think sometimes we get really distracted by a false binary, especially in our writing, where personal is over here to the left and civic is over here to the right. And you can't write about both at the same time. And they judge each other too, especially like if you feel like it's really important to document what is going on in our civic sphere, and you encounter a poetry that is incredibly inward and self-focused, it's really easy to judge it and say, oh, this is so frivolous, this is so self-centered, we are in an emergency and all the poets must respond, kind of thing. I think that to really do the deep work of self-change is just as much a activist stance as going out into the world and doing a picket line or going to a protest. And the reason I say that is because I truly don't believe that collective change can be lasting if the foundation is not a change that is inside the self. So if you want to live in a kinder, more just, more equal world, you have to go inside and ask yourself, what in me is greedy? What in me is hateful? What in me is selfish? Where am I wounded and unhealed? And then I just make everybody pay for it in my, my actions. I think it is so necessary to do that inner work. And so I don't believe in that false binary. I think increasingly my work wants to continuously try to make that through line. But the details will change. So Sky Burial is all about the death of my parents and dealing with grief. And the way I dealt with grief was to go into research on cross-cultural burial practices and attitudes about death and the actual biological processes of corpse decay, and then also the world of dream, and then Banana Palace just was very, very concerned about climate change and its relationship to resources and hunger, the way in which our hunger, our eating, our physical eating, what do you do with that conundrum? We got to eat, right? And then Now Do You Know Where You Are? Just very focused on change and also like, what world do I live in now? I feel like 2016, the 21st century really began. We elected Trump, and then shortly later there was a pandemic, and we're living through an incredible technological revolution that is going to have as much ramification on life as the Industrial Revolution did. It's just kind of like, now do you know where you are? No. But what all those books have in common is being located in the local, including the body and the psyche, and then also looking outward at the collective.
Right.
I guess that's what I would say.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Dana Levin, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Is there anything else that you want to bring into the conversation before we say goodbye?
Well, I'll just say that something that this phrase has been just circling in my head for the last couple of years, and I'll just offer it up to your audience. Poetry is an endurance technology. It can really help you weather whatever is going on with you. And I don't mean just writing it, I mean reading it, reading the work of others. The prose book that I'm working on is really all about that in terms of my own personal journey of becoming a poet, from babyhood up until I hit my 30s, and the way in which poetry was an endurance technology for me. Because we got to endure. It's a hard moment, and we got to figure out how to endure all the time.
It's crazy hard. Yeah, thank you for that. That's a beautiful place to close. Thanks for being with us today for Melody or Witchcraft. You can find out more about today's guest by going to danalevinpoet.com, DANALEVIN poet.com. Our theme music is by Emma Wallace. The podcast is available on all the usual platforms. For more information, join the Ask the Poet Substack, where you can listen as well and also find the complete show notes from today's show. Please comment, like, restack, recommend. We'd love to hear from you.
like a frog.